Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. My name is Nick Soberall, and I'm a member of the NERRS Science Collaborative staff. We're glad you can join us for today's webinar titled Resilience Dialogues, Strategies for Conflict Management in Collaborative Science. The webinar today is part of a monthly webinar series that features research, integrated assessment, and science transfer projects funded by the Science Collaborative. Webinars also feature projects from Science Collaborative team members as they engage the reserve system. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System, or NERRS, is a network of 29 unique research reserves as shown on the map. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. Each reserve site includes programs focused on land stewardship, research, and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. The NERRS Science Collaborative is one of the research funding mechanisms for the reserve system. In addition to providing grants, we also work to promote the research and engagement happening across the reserve system through webinars like today's. All attendees were muted upon entry, and we'll be handling questions via the question feature on the GoToWebinar console. We'll have time for questions during the middle and end portions of the webinar. However, we encourage you to submit your questions as they occur to you throughout the webinar by entering them into the questions field on the webinar console. It is my pleasure to introduce Christine Feurt. Chris is the director of the Coastal Training Program at the Wells National Estuarine Research Reserve in Maine. Chris integrates natural and social science into stakeholder processes using the collaborative learning approach in order to sustain ecosystem services and build resilient coastal communities. Chris's project today has brought together the shared experiences of reserves in managing conflict during collaborative research projects and has increased knowledge and awareness about the kinds of conflict that arise during collaborative science projects, the causes and consequences of conflict, and the times or phases of a project when conflict is most likely. Chris, I'll hand it over to you now.
Yes, thanks, Nick. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in and joining today. There'll be a couple of times during the webinar that I'll be asking some questions and asking for your opinions, and I hope you'll participate in that. Our project that I'm going to share today is called Resilience Dialogues, and there'll be two purposes of the webinar. One is to describe the actual Resilience Dialogues project and share some best practices and links to resources so that beyond this webinar time, you can get at what we've learned in this project. And I'm also going to identify key factors that contribute to the success of collaborative science transfer projects. So projects that are taking knowledge gained and moving that into another sphere. So two purposes for today's presentation. As Nick said, the National Estuarine Research Reserve System consists of 29 protected areas, and half or 15 of those reserves were involved in this project. So it was really the context was the reserve system and how to share the lessons we've been learning about collaborative science. Nick said something about the National Estuarine Research Reserve Science Collaborative. This collaborative funds research in all the reserves for both estuarine and coastal decision makers. It's managed by the University of Michigan Water Center through a cooperative agreement with NOAA. And as Nick said, it funds different kinds of projects. This project was a transfer project. So it's not really new research, it's moving research to new audiences. And all of the projects funded by the Science Collaborative address critical coastal management needs that are identified by each of the reserves. So it's very tied to local situations on the coast. Here's the story that kind of kicked off this particular project, and that was the idea that we've been working for a while on science collaborative projects, and we started realizing that collaborative science depends on successful boundary spanning, and boundary spanning is working at the edge between disciplines, between stakeholders, between agencies. And we feel that in the past 10 years, our lessons learned in collaborative science in the system, it's contributing to building both social and ecological resilience in the coastal communities where we work. So specifically, the Resilience Dialogue project created training and resources to build the skill of the boundary spanners who are working to link science to decision making. So the goal of the project was to work at that idea of boundary spanning. Now, some of you may have heard of that term, actually thinking maybe it's a new term, might consider yourself boundary spanners, but one of the earliest references in the literature to boundary spanning was from 1977. And the same is true with the term resilience. The first use of the word and the term around ecological resilience was also in the 70s. So you may be thinking the terms are new, but they've been around and people have been working with these ideas for a long time. So this is the number of reserves that were involved in the project. The project started in October of 2017 and will end in June of 2020. And we started out with a preliminary needs assessment. And wherever you see the little square icon on the picture that says National Estuarine Research Reserve Science Collaborative, kind of point to it with my cursor there, that means that that particular idea is a good trait for transferring science. So in this case, as we were writing the proposal for this project, we engaged stakeholders from half of the reserves and talked to them about what would be the most effective transfer, what do they need to do their jobs as boundary spanners. And these were the reserves that participated with us in that stage. And here's what we found out, as we were writing the proposal. So this is even before we were funded. The job of boundary spanning in the National Estuarine Research Reserve System is done by many different people, but most notably the Coastal Training Program coordinators. So within the reserve system, the Coastal Training Program focuses on the intersection between science and decision making through workshops, through tech transfer, and we work a lot with our local government, NGOs, and state agencies to move knowledge from the science to decision making. So during the past 10 years, and that's when this collaborative science approach has really been rolled out and evolved in the system, a group of Coastal Training Program coordinators have developed knowledge, in many cases the hard way, by facing challenges, and expertise specifically to this role of a collaborative lead, and in some cases, a principal investigator. So every funded project of the NERRS Science Collaborative has to have a collaborative lead. And the role of that person is kind of that boundary spanning role where they make sure by working with the project team that could be interdisciplinary researchers that their research is connected to the people that use it and need that science for decision making. So we've been doing the projects for about 10 years, and a large number of the Coastal Training Program coordinators have had experience even in multiple projects. And what we realized was happening that some of the CTP coordinators that had this 10 years of experience were getting ready to retire or had even moved to other jobs, and there was a danger that we would lose this experience and expertise about science transfer. So before we even wrote the proposal, we talked to both the more experienced CTP coordinators, and about half the CTP coordinators now were newer, and we said, would this be useful to you to get the transfer of this knowledge from one group to the next? So that's what kind of led us to create the project. So we have 3 goals that we worked on in the proposal, and we said what we wanted to do is synthesize these lessons learned, often around conflict, in this 10 years of practice with this new kind of science. So what could we learn about the role of the collaborative lead when they came up against conflict that made the projects harder to do or less impactful? Our second goal was to increase the capacity of the reserves and others to understand when conflict comes up when you're doing collaborative science. So the Coastal Training Program coordinators aren't the only kinds of people that work as boundary spanners, and I'm thinking that many of you on the call work as science integrators, project managers, or facilitators of teams that are doing collaborative science. So we wanted our lessons to be internal, but also external for folks like you. and we wanted to be able to improve collaboration among teams that are engaged in collaborative science in order to foster resilience, both in natural systems and coastal communities. So that's the goal of these resilience dialogues, is how can we have results that contribute to resilience. So resilience dialogues are a key ingredient of collaborative science. But another key ingredient of successful collaboration is understanding what you mean by the terms you're using. So I'm going to go right to this next point and describe what we mean by resilience dialogues. So resilience dialogues are conversations that occur among people with diverse perspectives who have agreed to collaborate to improve a situation that contributes to building social and ecological resilience. Now, when you look at the next slide, I want you to think of your own work, the work you're doing that might have attracted you to this topic. And as I deconstruct each aspect of the definition, I want you to think in your head, am I doing this kind of work? So this building shared meaning is another aspect of transferring the science. Before you can move science from one venue to another, you have to understand how people on each side of that boundary are seeing it. So does your work include conversations? Does it include people with diverse perspectives who have agreed to collaborate? So this particular definition is not about convincing people that aren't at the table. It's about people who have come to the table, agreed to work together, and said, we want to participate in improving a situation, and will improving that situation contribute to building social and ecological resilience? So thinking of those 5 attributes and thinking of your work, I will go to polling question 1. And I'd like to emphasize, we're only going to have 2 of these polls plus an exit evaluation. I really need your feedback, and it'll help us transfer this project to audience that aren't in the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. So based on that definition with the 5 elements, how would you rate your level of experience? I'm interested, but I don't have experience in resilience dialogues. I have been a participant in a resilience dialogue as we're defining them, or I have designed and or facilitated a resilience dialogue. So take a minute, and Nick will watch the voting and then let me know when we can check out the results. Okay, so half of you are here because you're interested, but you don't have experience in resilience dialogues. 28% you've been a participant, and 18% have designed or facilitated resilience dialogues. Well, good, that helps me out. I've seen a list of the names of people that are registered for the webinar, and we have over 100 people registered. So I really appreciate the interest and look forward to hearing any feedback you can give. Now, we'll go back to the presentation. There we are. So here's another trait about resilience dialogues and also about a transfer project. So some of you might be working with projects that are collaborative science, and you're thinking, well, it's time to move that science to another audience. So one of the key attributes of a resilience dialogue is you have to design activities with your people when they're dialoguing that reveal the diverse meanings that people are bringing to the table. And through revealing diverse meanings and thoughts and knowledge, you actually discover that there are shared goals at a very core level that you can tap into to move a project forward. So these kinds of attributes of a resilience dialogue is doing things that encourage individuals to voice their ideas and to share their knowledge. It's not just a one-way, it's a dialogue. The second attribute of a resilience dialogue is you actually, and when you're doing these, you teach the skills for active listening and skills for respecting the diversity of knowledge and meaning held by others. It might sound easy. It's not that easy to do, but it's possible. And this project was about how do we teach that skill so that more people can facilitate these dialogues. And what you're doing, what your goal in a resilience dialogue is, you're facilitating the development of shared meaning and the understanding that people see the whole system where the problem is located. They see that it's what we call a social ecological system. It's not just nature, it's not just people, it's both combined. And it's getting people to respect each other's ideas as much as they hold to their own. So resilience dialogues get at activities that do this kind of generation of shared meaning. Now, one of the most familiar ways we see the term resilience is kind of coastal resilience and disaster preparedness. And no doubt many of you are involved with your communities in kind of fostering that community resilience, so you're prepared for what happens. Others of you might be involved more in ecological resilience, salt marsh response to sea level rise and migration. But I wanted to get an idea of, for those of you that work in this area, what kind of work you're doing with either community resilience or ecological resilience. So in the next poll, I have 3 questions to try to get at what your work is about. And you'll see that one of the choices is other, and I hope you'll definitely jot something down in there. This is very important for the project. So those of you on the call, are you part of interdisciplinary teams conducting resilience research? There might be a hydrologist, a biologist, working with an ecologist. So do you work with teams that are interdisciplinary science teams conducting research? And that research might engage the community or other stakeholders. Do you interact with community members? So your primary work is with members of a community, say municipal government and community, and you can check more than one of these. Are you part of a planning team of professionals with diverse perspectives? I'm working with a group in Maine called the Maine Climate Council, and that has aquaculture professionals, it has the DMR and the DEP, and we're all working from our diverse perspectives on developing an action plan for climate for the state of Maine. If you've got other, please jot that down as well. I'm very interested in the other examples of where resilience dialogues are taking place. Okay, so interdisciplinary teams doing research, over a third, almost half working with community members to build resilience. So I bet you could teach me a few things about working with diverse perspectives, and then over half working on planning teams. So some of you are doing these multiple kinds. So I'll look forward to reading the other categories as well. And again, this is our second and last polling question during the presentation. I just want to put in a plug for staying on the line and finishing the final evaluation at the end. The organizers of the webinar says the normal percentage of people that take time to fill out that evaluation question at the end, and literally it takes less than 60 seconds, is only 10%. So my goal with you guys today is to try to get to 30%, and I'm offering a valuable prize. If you vote and I get that percentage up to 30%, and you come to Maine and tell me you're one of the ones that voted, I'll cook you a lobster in my backyard. So please fill out that final evaluation question at the end.
Wow.
Okay, so moving.
I want in.
Oh,
Chris, do you want me to read off a couple of the
one of the organizers. Yeah, you have to come to my office and say, and it has to get to 30% though. If we don't get to 30% on that final eval, there's no lobsters for anyone. All right.
You want me to read off a couple of the other responses, Chris?
Oh, that would be great. Thanks, Lynn.
Just to show folks that we are really watching and reading everything that gets entered. So we get a response for that other category of a regional collaborative. Someone else typed in that they work within the agency on a national level team to define resilience for policy purposes. And then someone else responded that if doing invasive species work qualifies as resilience work, then I'm doing that. And that falls in all of the categories that you had in the poll question.
Great. Yeah, I think with our working definition of what a resilience dialogue is, even if you've never called it that or never heard the term before, based on our project and what we've come up with, it kind of unifies the work that we all do. So thanks, Lynn. All right. And oh, there we go. And let me get, well, it goes to the next slide. Yeah, I'm not able to advance the slide to the next stuff.
Yeah, it does this sometimes. We've noticed that it's a weird little bug. What we're going to do here real quick, I think we'll just take advantage of the fact that this is acting up anyway to switch presenter laptops so I can make sure that all of your formatting is where it's supposed to be on the correct laptop. So I'm going to switch this over real quick. Stand by, please.
And everyone should feel free to type in questions as they occur to you throughout the presentation.
Yeah, there's going to be a break in a few slides. We'll take a break from me and see if you have questions in just a few minutes.
Okay. Make sure you still have control here, Chris.
Right. Should I try clicking or what should I do to see if I have control?
Yep. Should be all set. Go ahead and click the screen and you should be able to take over.
Right. Click on the screen. Okay, I'll go back. Okay, so now I want to share some of the findings or some of the results from the first part of our project, which is the needs assessment of where conflict was happening in the collaborative science projects. And again, this is from the perspective of the collaborative lead, the CTP coordinators, the ones whose job it was to facilitate the transfer of info. So these are just a summary of some of those results that relate to the products we then created because they were based on our results. So conflict arises during all phases of a collaborative science project. You're probably familiar with these: the proposal writing phase, actually implementing the project, stakeholder engagement, which should happen throughout the project, and then as the project wraps up, when dissemination to end users is critical. So examples of conflict arose in all of those phases from this 10 years of experience with this new brand of science. And we found that there were three kinds of conflict that were occurring. You could see if these match with your experience. There are conflict that would occur within the collaborative science team, conflict related to stakeholders and end users. And the difference between those two is a stakeholder could be someone that's engaged for the whole project. And could also be an end user, but then there are certain times where you truly have someone that when you're finished, they're an end user of the project. So we use both terms. And then there was conflict that just came around project management, which may be similar to things you've experienced. So I'm going to give an example of each kind of conflict And I'm gonna, there's 3 examples here so that the PowerPoint will stand alone when we're not in a webinar. But I'm going to highlight one type of conflict that became part of the training and the resources. So the within team conflict, a pretty common and powerful thing that would come up would be literally language barriers and differences in perspective from, say, an engineer to an ecologist to a municipal manager. A couple of other kinds of conflict were the importance of two-way communication was not as important to researchers as it was to the collaborative lead, who was kind of responsible for that. And then sometimes team member conflicts about meeting deadlines, which are pretty common in any kind of complex project. The second kind of conflict, end user and stakeholder conflict that came up, and the one that'll be highlighted in the training I'll talk about, was conflict between the goals and motivations of academic researchers and the coastal training program concern for the end users or stakeholder readiness, involvement, and expectation. So the coastal training program coordinators work with stakeholders about 100% of their time. So when these research projects would come in, frequently it was the audience of the CTP coordinator, who they were very connected with, who was being linked to the research. And in many cases, CTP coordinators felt that researchers overpromised what could really happen, and then end users were disappointed. And there was also the concern if the research reserve had a reputation and then a research project didn't meet its goals, that had an effect on the reputation of the reserve. For project management conflict, the traditional role of a principal investigator in research is not the same on a collaborative project, or it's not the same as a collaborative lead. So for the 10 years previous to now, we're kind of learning what it felt like to do a collaborative project where the end users were linked to the project from the beginning. So these were things from the needs assessment results that we then wanted to see, well, how can we design something to teach people how to deal with these conflicts? And let me just check okay, we're going to stop here. Actually, I'm going to go back because that gives away something. Let's take a break here and see if anybody has any questions. So after this slide, we'll go into the actual products and the training we created to deal with the kind of conflicts we learned about. So any questions?
Yes, one question here. This is Lynn. This is actually probably more of a question for Nick. Will the presentation be available after the webinar?
Yes, it will. We will put together a webinar brief, which will have the presentation deck and summary points that will summarize Chris's awesome notes that she has for herself in a way that kind of reads as more of a narrative. That'll be available in the coming weeks after the webinar. And the recording will be available in 1 to 3 days as well.
And the second part, or the last part of the presentation, has multiple techniques that I have links to all of the materials that are part of the project that are kind of like how-to guides and resources for what we came up with to help boundary spanners deal with these types of conflicts. So that's what the rest of the presentation will be about, and you'll have links to get to all of those resources.
There's no other questions at this time, Chris. Maybe.
Yeah, there might be more, and there'll be questions at the end. So I'll just go ahead with the what we developed to deal with training people to deal with this kinds of conflict. So we pulled out 4 best practices for designing and facilitating collaborative science. So again, this is geared not as much for the scientist participating, but for the person whose role it is to keep that boundary spanning going. So our first and probably most important best practice is to adapt the collaborative learning approach to provide boundary spanning methodology for collaborative science. And I like to call collaborative learning, it's like the scientific method for collaborative science and for boundary spanning. Just like we use the scientific method to do the biophysical and social science side, collaborative learning is like the scientific method for how to do boundary spanning. Our second best practice, and I'll give examples of each of these, is to do an assessment of the social ecological system where the project is embedded. And I'll be giving an example from one of the most detailed social ecological system assessment, and with links for how you can read what that project did. Number 3 best practice is develop a common language among interdisciplinary teams that includes local knowledge. And again, I'll have links to one of the best examples in the system where an actual terminology directory was created to keep conversation flowing. And 4th best practice is to reveal and use mental and cultural models knowledge to develop shared meaning, manage conflict, and track progress. And I'll go through each of these 4 with examples of where reserves worked on this. So we did 4 case studies, even though every single reserve in the country has examples of resilience dialogues. We were trying to link what we were creating to what we heard in the needs assessment. So this adapting the collaborative learning approach to provide boundary spanning methods for collaborative science was best illustrated in the Deal Island Peninsula Project, which was a partnership with the Chesapeake Bay, Maryland Reserve, Maryland DNR, and the University of Maryland Anthropology Department. So this project is ongoing, and each of the projects I'll share is just one snapshot in time, because most of the projects that are picked for best practices have many collaborative projects, and they've been doing this for 10 years. So just a word about what collaborative learning is, and there'll be a link provided to the collaborative learning guide. It's based on 3 different theories: the systems theory, conflict theory, and adult learning theory. It's very practical. Practitioners can read a book and learn how to do this, but it's a very sound social science-based project of bringing people together. So we've used this approach at the Wells Reserve for about 15 years, and this collaborative learning guide is something we developed to train people, or for people just read to see how collaborative learning can be used on their projects. The goal of collaborative learning is constructive debate and effective implementation of proposals that are generated by the stakeholders. So it's originally the work of Daniels and Walker, who worked with the Forest Service. So it's very practitioner focused. It's not just something an academic can do. It's a 4-phase process: the iterative process, assessment before you get started, then designing a collaborative learning event, and then implementing it and evaluating it. And the reason the Deal Island project was highlighted is they used so many different approaches to collaborative learning. They had collaborative research projects. Their issue was erosion and land erosion in salt marshes on the Chesapeake Bay, which is one of the most fastest eroding portions along our coast. And they worked with the Deal Island community and engaged the community in the research, and then over time did collaborative research, community conversations, and engaged faith-based communities, and 2 or 3 PhD dissertations documented the work of this particular project. But it used a very diversified collaborative learning approach on the coast of the eastern shore of Maryland. The other thing that collaborative learning creates is a safe space to share ideas. Again, based on a very solid assessment, it respects the expertise in the room, and people learn by doing. Again, it's iterative, it uses adult learning principles, and it aims to make progress. It's not about everybody agreeing, which is very hard to get at. It's about agreeing to improve a situation that builds resilience. So that's been used in a number of the projects, and it was one of the training modules we developed to train other people on how to use this particular project. The second best practice is about assessment. And one of the best examples of assessment was at the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in New Hampshire, where stakeholders, government agencies, researchers had worked on protecting buffers and working to get the nitrogen levels in Great Bay down to a manageable level. This particular project was after a series of collaborative projects, and one of the best things it did was a community assessment. And the community assessment, and there's a link to what that assessment looks like, it involved interviews, focus groups, and really meeting with the decision makers who had control of buffers on their own property or who were regulators. And then that assessment information was used to develop how-to guides for stakeholders, how to work with landowners to protect buffers, how to work with the regulations. And their particular website, which you'll have the link to, has some of the most amazing resources of any of the collaborative science projects because it was based on such a strong assessment before the project got going. So this was the best example, and we've used this in our trainings to train people on how to do detailed assessments. And then the third best practice is about developing a common language among interdisciplinary teams. So those of you that have worked on interdisciplinary teams, you probably have rich experience with the ways you just talk over time and people start learning each other's language. But for the Sustainable Shorelines Project at the Hudson River NERRS in New York, the problem was hardened shorelines, sea level rise. Even though the Hudson River NERRS is way upriver from the estuary, it's still tidal. And having to deal with sustainable shorelines involved engineers, municipal officials, state officials, and researchers. And this project's been going on in different iterations for about 10 years. But when it first started, they couldn't even talk to each other because the terminology was so different. So Emily Hauser, the Coastal Training Program Coordinator, actually developed a guide to the terminology and with scientific citations, so each scientist could respect the science of others. So you'll have a link both to that project and to the terminology guide, which is kind of a best practice. And then the last of the best practices is about mental and cultural models knowledge. And that was done here at the Wells Reserve with a project called Protecting Our Children's Water, where we were using knowledge of mental and cultural models to work with watershed management and diverse stakeholders trying to work to protect water quality in Maine. And I'll take just a minute. The mental and cultural models piece is kind of new. It's not something that a lot of people get trained in, especially if you're trained as a biological or ecological scientist. Mental models is from the field of psychology, and cultural models are from the field of anthropology. And I usually introduce it with this great Mark Twain quote, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And that is one of the common causes of conflict, where people think they know, first of all, they think they know what each other is thinking. Oh, I know what he or she is thinking. So getting at what's really going on is a key aspect of success in these projects. So I put some definitions here, but I'm just going to focus on the last one. Again, the more detail is for people reading the PowerPoint who aren't on the call. But cultural models are shared perceptions and attitudes about how the world works. They're implicit, like we don't even think that we're using them when we're thinking. We take them for granted, and they're often below the level of consciousness. So the training we developed was to teach boundary spanners how to get at the hidden cultural and mental models that people are using to think about a situation in order to develop kind of shared understanding. And the resources that I've shared with you include an activity that we developed into training that involves making a situation map. And the process of creating this map with stakeholders is a way to reveal the cultural and mental models that people are using about an issue and building systems understanding. So the resources that are part of this project are activities you can take, excuse me, right off the shelf and use in your work to understand the mental and cultural models that people are using. So kind of the takeaways from the webinar, because I'm just introducing the resources here. The resources are all, the ones that are finished are available now, and the others will be available by this summer. So the Resilience Dialogue's best practices are about having that kind of like a scientific method for organizing your boundary spanning activities. And collaborative learning, I've looked into many other methods, but it's one that's the best for practitioners. You don't have to have a PhD to use it. You can train people at any level of job. I've trained undergraduate students on how to use this approach, and it does provide the architecture for collaborative science. And then the importance of assessing the social ecological system. Don't just think that you know what the stakeholders are thinking. That is the biggest danger in collaborative science, is kind of guessing what they think. So having that assessment when a proposal is developed or when you're transferring science is very important. Then developing a common language, especially when interdisciplinary teams are working with local people, so they're all speaking the same language. And then getting at the mental and cultural models that people are using to think about the problem. This is very key for building a systems understanding. Then the key factors that relate to transfer projects is the needs assessment has to begin before a proposal is even written. And that's one thing we've learned as a system from the Science Collaborative, is that in order to qualify for funding with a project idea, you have to already have that needs assessment, knowing who will use the science and how they'll use it. And the impact of collaborative science depends on this specific quality, this boundary spanning, and how it's done. It's a standalone skill. Many people do this kind of work kind of part-time, but increasingly there are people whose role is to be a boundary spanner. Developing clear, practical goals, and I, again, emphasize the practical. Our whole project was geared around what could practitioners use? What could the new CTP coordinator who just finished college, is coming in on the job, how can we transfer these skills to them so they can hit the ground running? And that the goal of the boundary spanning activities is to build shared meaning so that the conflict doesn't take over, because people are working at a level where they understand each other's thinking and they see that at the base level they have shared goals for the project. So here's what our resources will look like when we're done. We've done trainings, and all of the material for continuing the trainings or for someone who would like to do a training for their staff includes the 4 best practices modules, workbook, agenda, and worksheets, and those are already available. Our case studies are being developed, and there are some videos that go with that. We've also, which although I didn't talk about it today, we've brought the Crucial Conversations training, which is about the one-on-one conversations that are difficult. During the project, that came up from our end users, so we're now offering that training through the Estuarine Research Reserve System, which we had never done before. And then we'll have what's called clickable links, where you can look for an aspect of your work that you're interested in, and the resources for collaboration will be available. And here's my contact information, so when you're coming to get that lobster because you filled out the evaluation, this is how you reach me, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Just as a reminder, you can send your questions through the questions feature on the GoToWebinar console at any time by writing them in. Any questions that we don't get a chance to answer as part of the webinar will be included in the webinar brief.
I got a question for you, Chris, that I think you started to answer, but question about whether you have any resources specifically for when there's language barriers within the team, disciplinary or, language of, birth differences.
Yes, and I'm sorry I don't have that much experience on this project with actual real language differences with different languages. It was more with disciplinary languages. But Emily's work on creating that terminology guide and also just identifying that there are barriers in language, and as a facilitator or a boundary spanner, it's starting to collect those, almost making a game of it, how people can be attentive to calling each other on terms they don't understand. And when we train teams to do collaborative science boundary spanning, we spend a little time on social science skills like interviewing one-on-one. So before you get a group in the room, you've already talked to individuals and you can anticipate some of the things that might come up so that you as a facilitator know what to expect before you've got a big group in a room, and to establish that culture of let's make sure everybody understands each other.
Mm-hmm. This next question actually is a really nice extension, I think, of that question. Someone's wondering how this applies to working with tribal nations as well. Any special concerns or considerations there?
Yes, we do have some of the reserves that have done research projects with tribal nations, and one of my colleagues here at the Wells Reserve is working with some of the tribes out west. And I just was talking to that colleague today, and she talked about it's not just the language, it's also the pace at which people work. And one of the reasons I like the cultural models aspect so much is it is a body of work from anthropology. That's the other thing you'll find if you look at the Deal Island project and all of its resources, because the key lead researcher on that is an anthropologist, and the 3 PhDs that have been produced out of that project are all from the anthropology department. So the Deal Island project and the cultural models work will have resources because it draws so heavily from anthropology. So we tend to think of anthropology as working with cultures outside our own, but the work that we did with the NERRS, we brought that anthropological approach into, we're kind of working in our own culture, but we're using the tools that anthropology uses to listen and understand and really be able to appreciate the different perspectives that people bring. So one of the handouts, excuse me, that you've got a link to is a literature review of cultural models research in coastal management. So that's a good one to kind of see the other work that's been done, some of which is with tribal entities.
That's great. Thanks, Chris. Here's another question. You mentioned that typically stakeholders have agreed to be part of the process and be at the table. This person is asking if you've got any resources or tips for when participants have been told to participate. Any advice or best activities to help move for authentic engagement?
Yes, being voluntold to participate.
Yeah.
When we were doing the Protecting Our Children's Water project in Maine, we would have our stakeholder group included municipal officials like the Public Works Director or the highway person, and they were kind of directed by the selectmen to come to the workshops. But in one of the first activities we did, and that we always do with collaborative learning approach, is establish a connection between that person's work and the goals of the project. Because we might have in our mind, well, we're doing a watershed management project, but how does that relate to the jobs of a public works director or a highway supervisor? And that's done right up front, where you start creating this idea of the system that's involved in water quality protection. And I have a concept that's in the collaborative learning guide called the kaleidoscope of expertise. And that is an activity that a facilitator does so that people say, someone might have told me to be here, but there, I see my job right there, and my work is important to solving this issue. It can't be done without me.
Yeah, it's a great example.
And another thing we do in all our activities at the Wells Reserve, we have different principles we operate by, and those of you who have been to our activities know one of our principles is that our collaborative learning activities are super fun.
And often have good food.
And also have good food. And you get to come to the coast of Maine. And I said that jokingly, but that's another commonality. People very much care about their homes and their place. So as you work with understanding the system and mental and cultural models, that attachment to place is very powerful. And that's something that a group can gather around and think about that shared commitment to the place where they live.
Mm-hmm. So, question for you, Chris. I know you've been doing this type of work for many years now. Were there what was most surprising to you about doing this particular project where you did, a deep dive into the process and potential conflicts?
I think one of the most surprises came up during the needs assessment, looking at the different types of conflict. The reason we worked on the grant is something had happened here in Maine that was surprising as far as conflict coming up. And I said, well, I wonder if conflict is happening in these projects in other reserves, because typically when you see the final report or you see a presentation at a conference or a paper gets published, you don't really know the rest of the story. And it was hearing that the problems we'd experienced in Maine and my colleague in New Hampshire, there were other coastal training program coordinators that recognized the same conflict. And so being able to design something that, so they wouldn't be surprised, like, oh, okay, that's going to occur. I'm ready for it. Here's a tool to use. So it was the diversity of conflict and that it was pretty common. There's a good resource out there called The Science of Team Science. So any academics on the phone, you're probably aware of this, but increasingly team science is interdisciplinary with very large groups. And the National Science Foundation has even funded a huge project capturing lessons learned on team science. And if you just Google the Science of Team Science, you can access those National Science Foundation resources.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I was just thinking about that that set of resources too. So I get another question.
Yeah, one of the strengths. Oh, go ahead.
No, you finish your thought.
I was just going to say that, again, this idea of a transfer project, we're working in the Estuarine Research Reserve system, making a product for our colleagues who are working in the system, but it's very linked to these national efforts to do the same thing. And I'm sure that your organizations, folks, you're probably trying to do the same thing, but this was designed to help elevate the Estuarine Research Reserve system and our ability to do this kind of work.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So here's a question. How can collaborative leads best address mismatches between the pace of planning, including interviewing, focus groups, data collection, analysis, and stakeholder time commitments?
Yeah, the stakeholder, kind of this, we call it the stakeholder burnout question, where you've got your stakeholders and the time it would take them, to participate with you in the interviews. And sometimes it's just a matter of making sure that you have enough. You have people that you don't always go to the same person all the time. Now, an interesting approach that was used on the Deal Island project, because it is based on anthropological techniques, they wanted the stakeholders, the watermen, the people who are out on the water, to participate in their project. So part of their proposal was money to pay those working watermen and women to leave the water for a day and participate. And that's not an unusual protocol in anthropology, but it's valuing their time enough to say, we want you to participate, and here's the funding for you to take the day off the water and come in. So it's kind of an extreme example, but on another project we did, where we did focus groups, and again, we put the funding in the grant to pay people to participate in the focus groups, to pay them for their time to spend, an evening, 2 or 3 hours being in a focus group. And again, that's a standard protocol. That was an ecological economics project, and it was a standard protocol. The university, had built it in, and it wasn't the first time that funds were allocated for that kind of work.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also sort of the related issue of just research projects just going more slowly than stakeholders might want.
Yes, that came up in the interviews as well. They want that smoking gun, want that answer right away. So it's the other role of the boundary spanner is helping end users and stakeholders to understand science and understand the slow pace and what uncertainty means. And it really is, it's a balancing act when you're in the middle between the research and the way research has to be done to be valid, and then the expectations of the stakeholders.
Maybe we can squeeze in these last two questions, Chris. A question about, have you ever encountered conflict? There's a question about conflicts with intellectual property when working with groups of academics. Does that come into play?
I don't have experience with it, but of course it would be very common. It's, one of the most important attributes of scientific research, and most grants, that's just understood that until research results can be published. So if that causes a problem with stakeholders, the research has to be designed in a way that you can respect that intellectual property, but still engage stakeholders. So that's why it's new. That's why it's a different way of doing this. And the Science Collaborative has resources about how to design this kind of project. And you also have the link. That link was provided too. But I haven't run into that here at the reserve. But of course, it's a standard question. I haven't experienced it. Most of my work is with the stakeholders and working with them in an open way.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Another question here about working with folks with learning disabilities. Any tips for how to recognize and build dialogues with folks who might have different styles of learning?
Ooh, and that's a good one it relates to the assessment. And of course, you think I was a college professor for 20 years, and thought about that every day of my life, that I was in the classroom. And that goes along with the principles of adult learning in general. And collaborative learning, the aspect of doing the assessment helps you understand before you get a group in the room what you're facing and how you might need to design around learning disabilities or styles of learning. And collaborative learning allows you to do everything from a boat trip where people are out seeing the resource to a tour of a factory that's related to water pollution. It doesn't just have to be, don't just imagine being in a room. And again, the Deal Island Project had a lot of examples of how the people that lived on the eastern shore of Maryland were engaged in the research that was happening right in their backyard.
Mm-hmm. So there's just maybe time for one last question here, Chris. I'm not quite sure if this will relate to your kind of framing. A question about how do you respect stakeholders while also researching them? Do you feel like your projects do that? Research?
Yeah, and that's a basic. That's what did you say right then, Lynn? What was the last thing?
You go ahead. Just whether you feel like you are researching your stakeholders.
That's a very basic tenet of social science. And when you're trained as a social scientist, one of the first things you learn is the part of respecting the people that you're working with. And there are very strict standards. This was not a research project. It was more of a training design project. But there are very strict protocols that social science researchers have to follow. It's called the Institutional Review Board, and universities will look at your proposal for research and make sure that it doesn't violate any of the rights and privileges of the people you're working with. For this project, we're coming with the frame of, we're doing a needs assessment. Our goal was to develop training and resources, and so we were talking to people about their work and what they needed for their work. But granted, on some of the other projects, on the Deal Island project, again, which was anthropology, all the protocols for Institutional Review Board were followed for that research that was done, as opposed to this transfer project, which is about designing training and outreach materials.
Great, thank you, Chris.
We are over our time. We did want to make sure we had lots of the questions rolling in. We wanted to make sure we had time to answer all of them. I do have a few announcements as we wrap up. Just one quick one regarding the resources that are in here. I will leave the webinar platform open for a few minutes for anybody who'd like to go through and click all the resources and access them if you haven't already. They will also be attached to the email that will go out. It's slated to go out tomorrow at the same time as the webinar, so you can expect to see those as well. As we wrap up, 2 webinar announcements. We have 2 webinars coming up in March, one on the 11th and one on the 17th. Both webinars are in the realm of ecosystem services provided by wetlands. March 11th will feature a team from the Old Woman Creek Reserve and University of Toledo who will present work from their project estimating the phosphorus retention capacity of Ohio coastal and riverine wetlands. And then our March 17th webinar is our next panel webinar on the topic of blue carbon. Panelists representing 4 regions across the United States will share lessons learned from their work leading blue carbon projects and offer ideas for advancing the use of blue carbon for coastal wetland management. As you leave the webinar, as Chris mentioned, and very nicely incentivized you all to do, please take a few minutes and take the exit survey. It really only does take a few seconds, and it helps us refine the webinar series. We do read the feedback as it comes in, and the presenters love to see what kind of thoughts you guys have during the webinar as well. And with that, we'll just end with a big thank you to Chris for being such an awesome presenter and taking the time to be with us today. And thank you all for joining us.
Yes, thank you all for joining. I look forward to reading those evaluations, 30% of you filling out those evaluations.